I love church. I've been pastoring as a senior pastor for 18 years. The first church this is the third church that I've pastored. The first church that I pastored was in a tourist city and had a ton of turnover. So what I mean by that is every 2 years, probably 80% of my church or more would be completely new. And so every 2 years we'd have almost a complete turnover. That included leaders. That was, the board. That was all the key volunteers would just suddenly go away. And so we had a church that would fluctuate from about 120 people to just around 200 people. And then every summer I would say goodbye to about 80 people. And they would move out of town and we'd have to start all over again. And I was extremely frustrated because I wasn't seeing church growth like I wanted. Just when I thought I had momentum, it would go away and I'd have to restructure. So one thing that I learned, though, and I pastored in that town for 9 years, and one thing that I learned in pastoring there was I learned how to train leaders because we were constantly training leaders and working leaders. And what I didn't know then is that as much as I hated being there and pastoring in that community, it was probably the best Bible school I could ever get because I learned principles there that I'm cashing in on now. And went through, and so some of the seasons you go through in ministry, if you're feeling frustrated and it's slow and it's not going, God's probably growing you as much as he is anything else. And the rope will catch. And what I mean by that is, because that's what a pastor told me when I was lamenting to him how frustrated I was with how slow my church was growing. The rope will catch. And what he meant by that is if you go water skiing, do you water ski around here? Not really? Not really. It's a bigger lake. Water skiing is you get towed behind a boat on a ski and you get to water ski. Well, the thing is you sit on a dock and the boat takes off and the boat leaves and you're just sitting there and it's gone and you see the rope just go and eventually the rope catches and you're launched. And it's the same thing in leadership and in ministry is that you can take off as a leader sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily mean as you're learning and growing as a leader, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rope is catching yet. And so you think, I'm growing faster than my church is growing. What's happening? What's wrong? Wait, because the rope will eventually catch. And you grow, there's no choice but for the church to grow. When I was pastoring in this town, I began to rethink church and how to do it because I was desperate. And I didn't realize then the process that my brain was going through and how to rethink pastoring and doing it, because all I was doing was pastoring exactly how I saw everybody else doing it and expecting the same results everybody else did. And for the longest time, to be honest, I was doing exactly what Pastor Al talked about this morning. I was living in somebody else's shoes and expecting the same results and didn't get it. When the rope caught, it's when I kind of settled into what I was called to do and doing ministry my way, I guess is the best way to say it, and doing that. And what I learned is something about how to make disciples. And this is what I want to teach today. And I want to go through and I want to give you something that it's a structure, a foundation of how to build and how to restructure your ministry. And I am convinced, because I've been working this system now for 6-7 years, and I'm convinced now that this structure and this system is one that I kept to myself for a long time and didn't share until recently. We looked at it and said, this is not something, this is part of the ministry that you can copy from me if you like, because this is the skeleton of how ministry works and how discipleship in particular works. And if you build on the skeleton everything that you are and that your giftings are, your church, I'm convinced, will grow. And so we're sharing this now with pastors everywhere and seeing amazing results. Once I got to Lethbridge and saw this, I took over the church in Lethbridge just over 5 years ago. And the church, when I took it over, was about 250 people in weekly attendance, really struggling, losing $10,000 a month, and was basically in a desperate situation where the board was threatening we're going to have to close the doors, we're going to have to sell stuff off. They're talking about selling chunks of the property off and all the rest of it because it was just in a desperate situation. So when I was asked to go in there, I was asked to change everything, and had to change it quickly because it wouldn't survive unless. And when I got in there, the one thing that I did is I began to really tap into the heartbeat of what the church was founded in and the heartbeat of what Victory churches were founded in, and realized that the church drifted dramatically from the original vision. And if you tap into, being Victory pastors, if you tap into the heartbeat of Victory churches, Reach, Teach, Mobilize, and what that really means, and we're going to break that down because that structure is what this is based off of. When you actually put that to work and properly and work it, it's amazing what will happen in your ministry, because that's the mantle we're under, that's the blessing that we're under. And all we did in Lethbridge was change the church back to its origin. The methods were different because we updated them, but the message was the same. And if you can tap into this for your church wherever you are, it will work wonders. I think the Reach, Teach, Mobilize vision, the Victory vision, is the closest God-given vision I've tapped into on the planet, as close as to the Book of Acts, the original vision from the Book of Acts, as I've ever seen any other organization. And it works because it's thousands of years old. We'll mess with the methods and add our flavors to it, but the message is sacred. Right, so I want to give you a structure. Now, at the top of your notes, this is what I want you to do. I want you to write, there's going to be 4 words you're going to write across the top. Okay, on the top left word, I want you to write mission. Okay, and then I want you to put an arrow to the next word, which is going to be vision. Okay, so you got mission, put an arrow pointing towards vision, put an arrow pointing towards model. Model, M-O-D-E-L, model, and then another arrow to programming. Okay, and this is the base of the structure of what we do, and I'll show you how this works, and then you can add your thing to it. The mission is the why of the organization. Okay, it's everything must start with why. There's a great TED Talk that led to a great book called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. And he said this, in studying all the biggest businesses around the world, the most successful business around the world, he said the defining factor between all these businesses is that most businesses start, and most churches start with what? Okay? So when you're advertising your church, when you're talking to people in your neighborhood about your church, what do you talk about? Do you talk about what your church does? How your church operates? Do you talk about the what and the how? Or do you understand the why? And he says everything, it's not bad to talk about the what and the how, but the foundation of everything must start with why. Right? So an example in the business world is, he said this, and I thought it was fascinating. He's talking about at the turn of the 20th century, when just before cars were invented and planes were invented and all these things, he said the railroads owned everything. All transportation in the world was controlled by some of these big railroad companies, and they owned everything. Any part of the world, the railroad was the key. And these companies owned everything. And he said, what would have happened if the railroads would have understood not what they did? What they did was trains. Okay? But what if they would have understood why they existed?
And the reason why these railroad companies existed was transportation to get things from point A to point B. If they would have understood why they existed, the railroad companies would have owned all the trucking industry, all of the airline industry. They still today would have been the most powerful companies in the world. And yet, 100 years later, because they missed the why, they basically have disappeared. Isn't that fascinating? Another example is a company that's founded on the why is Apple. Computers was founded on the why. And one of the examples that they used in the book, and I thought this was fascinating, was when an MP3 player came out. The MP3 player, first one invented was from Citizen. It's called the Citizen Zen. That was a big clunky thing. And they advertised it. And yet a year later, Steve Jobs comes out and he introduces the iPod. And the iPod, when he introduced the iPod, Citizen was advertising saying, we've got this MP3 player that's got 500, whatever, this much. And they talked about what it did. But Steve Jobs came out and he advertised this little iPod thing. He says, this thing will hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. And iPod took over the market. And he explained why. Not what, he explained why. Now, in the church world, we don't talk much about the why. The church has to start with why. As pastors, we need to understand why we exist. And if you're looking for, well, why does my church exist? Let me give you a hint. You're not going to find it and make it up. Jesus gave it to you. Okay? It's called the Great Commission, okay, which is cooperative mission. The Great Commission, that means all of us have the same mission. And that mission is, go into all the world, make disciples. Okay? It's not, if you're looking for something more sexy than that, there's not. That's the mission. That's not going to change. That's written. That was Jesus gave us the mission. That one is set. The problem now, if I was to go around and talk with all of you and ask you, okay, so define for me what a disciple is. Go into all the world and make disciples. Okay, so what's a disciple? Anybody? A follower of Jesus? Anybody else? If you actually talk to most Christians, the hesitation is the fact that we don't know. And this is the problem that I thought, and we looked at it as a church, and I sat down with my pastors and I said, tell me what a disciple is. And the closest we could come up with was a fully devoted follower of Christ. I was like, okay, that's a great answer. I love that. Fully devoted follower of Christ. How do we make one? I said, and by the way, how do we know if they're fully devoted or 80% devoted or 99% devoted, but not quite there? How do we know? Right? It's difficult to be able to discern. I was like, well, if we're gonna go make one, we should probably know what one is. Right? And so I said, we need to define it from the Bible. We need to define it, but we need to define it from the Bible, yes, but we need to define it for our church so that they know how to go and make one. Because our job is to equip or to coach or to skill develop our church to make disciples. But if we don't even know what one is, if it's fuzzy in the pulpit, it's going to be an absolute mystery in the pew. So we need to be able to define what a disciple is for our church in order for us to go and make one. So we began this journey of defining what a disciple is. And we looked all throughout the scriptures. And in defining the disciple, we came across this one verse. And this revolutionized our ministry. We came across this one passage, and it was actually at a conference that Pastor George was preaching. And he quoted this verse, and he read out of this verse. And as he's reading it, my mind, because I'm asking this question, what is a disciple? What is a disciple? What is a disciple? And we just had this discussion. We're at a conference. Pastor George reads this verse, and as he's reading it, all of a sudden, have you ever done this when you're in a church service or at a conference where you get the revelation, you're getting the download, and then your mind is completely gone? I didn't hear anything else. Pastor George said, I was like, my mind, I was writing like crazy because I was like, oh my goodness, this is the answer, this is the answer, this is the answer. And when I found it, I was like, wow. and I began to work it. Now, we've been working it now for 3 years at our church, and since we've worked it, we've averaged over 400 people coming to Christ every year. This year, we're on track for around 800 coming to Christ. We've got 600 and just under 700 people that have come to Christ so far this year. But we were making converts, but we weren't making disciples. We made a lot of converts, but they weren't sticking. We changed this and defined for our people what a disciple was, and all of a sudden, our church has grown exponentially. We've grown by 400 and some people this year so far, and a lot of those are the brand new believers that have come in, and it's really worked. And it was so simple, sitting there right there in front of it. And the scripture that Pastor George read was 1 John 2. Okay, now in 1 John 2. John is writing to the early church, and he writes something interesting. He says, I write to you, this is verse 12 to 14. He says, I write to you little children, I write to you young men, and I write to you fathers. And I'm thinking about this because I was trying to put myself into John's shoes, and I'm thinking about this. John is writing to the early church, and he's defining 3 different categories of people in his church. And the categories that he uses, the terms that he uses as little children, he wasn't writing to the children's ministry. He was writing to those who were spiritually little children, okay, recently born again, okay. Then he says, I write to you young men. He wasn't writing to the youth group, right? He was writing to those spiritual teenagers. Then he says, he doesn't say, I write to you old men. He says, I write to you fathers. Now, as I began to break these down, I thought it very interesting how the Bible, even though it was written by Jews, it didn't use business terms. Even though it was written to Romans, it didn't use military terminology. Even though it was written to the Greeks, it didn't use philosophical or these kind of things. It used family language. And so whenever it addresses the church, it says sons and daughters, fathers, mothers. It uses all of these family terms, sisters, brothers. Like it uses all of these terms, family terms, which is on purpose by God. So I took this scripture and I sat down on a whiteboard with our staff, and I went through this and I said, wait a second, let's work this again. What if a disciple is this? And this is how we define a disciple. A disciple is a convert or born again, right? That's stage 1. Then a disciple becomes a little children. And I said, what makes a little child a little child? Well, a little child, and I thought about this because I have 6 kids, and my youngest is the cutest little girl. I know everyone says this, I'm sorry, but my daughter is the cutest in the... Everyone says it, but she's just a doll. But she's got me wrapped around her fingers, what it really is. My wife looks at me and goes, it's all good. But I looked at my little 2-year-old, and I thought, as a little child, what's different about her from my 19-year-old son? Right? And I got 3 teenage boys. What's the difference? Well, my 2-year-old is completely dependent on me, and she needs me to feed her. She can't feed herself. She makes messes, and I love her anyway. Right? She's needs me to do everything for her, as far as bedtimes and clothing and everything. She's completely dependent. I said, my young men, when you look at this, and that's stage 3 is young men, the young men have the ability to feed themselves. They're independent. Okay, and my teenage boys feed themselves quite regularly, actually. They don't need any help from me other than to stock the fridge. That's all I got to do, and and oil the hinges is basically really what I need to do. And they feed themselves quite often. And young men are strong, right? Which John writes to the early church. He says, I write to you young men because you are strong in the word and have overcome the evil one. I write to you little children because you've overcome sin, right? And I write to you fathers because you've known him from the beginning. And as I thought about this, I was like, okay, young men are strong in the Word. They have the ability to feed themselves. The Word. So they become strong. They've overcome the evil one. Then it says, I write to you fathers. And I was like, okay, what makes a father? What's a father? A father is now, it doesn't say old men, it says fathers. How does a young man become a father? He reproduces. And I was like, So he's writing to a pocket of people in the scriptures. He's writing to somebody, a group of people in the scriptures who have become now disciple makers, who have dependence of their own. They're responsible. So the little child is, I need to feed. The young men feed themselves, and the fathers feed others. Okay, and I was like, this is a progression. And so we defined a disciple as born again, little children, young men, fathers. And then we began to work this process and said, okay, now that we defined it, we know how to make them. And then we go to the stage 2, which is the vision. Everyone's tracking with me so far? Okay, so we go to vision. Vision now describes what we do. Okay? Now, I got to commend you guys, Victory Asia. Here's what I need to commend you. You guys have the clearest understanding of the vision of any of us in the movement around the world. Right? The moment, and I commend Pastor Al and Pastor Rich on this because it's driven into you guys, and you're doing it. So the vision, what we do is, what do? We reach, teach, mobilize. Does the vision complement the mission? Yeah. You can't make a disciple, if our job is to go into the world and make disciples, you can't make a disciple unless you reach them. Isn't that right? Okay? You got to teach. So now watch. If you look at this and saying, where would I put reach as part of the process of making a disciple? Well, I got to reach somebody to get them born again so that they become little children. Once they're little children, I got to teach them and feed them to where they become strong enough to feed themselves. And once they become strong enough to feed themselves, I got to mobilize them to become a father. Right? Now watch. This is what I love about the reach, teach, mobilize vision. Is once I'm mobilized, it's circular. You ever notice that? I'm reaching, I'm teaching, I'm mobilizing to reach, to teach, to mobilize, to reach, to teach, to mobilize. We should exponentially grow if we do this properly. Right? Church growth shouldn't be our problem. And our vision is not to grow a big church. Our vision is to reach, teach, mobilize. That complements our mission. Okay? Now, the next stage is the model. The model is what I've been missing for years and years and years as a pastor. Because what I went right from the vision. Mission was fuzzy. Vision I was okay with. But then I went right from that to the programming. And sometimes the programming becomes the vision. If you get backwards in things, some churches run off of programs more than they do. They die on the hill of the program. Right? What do we do as a church? What do? Well, we start talking about our programs. Well, we run this kind of service. And don't make the mistake, hopefully after you get through this, don't make the mistake of thinking that my church is growing because of our creative program. The creative program serves the mission and the vision. Okay? We don't serve the program. By the time you catch up to what we're doing, we've probably moved on in our program and said, that's not working anymore. That's why you don't copy anybody. Right? Because by the time you sing a Hillsong song and thinking this is the greatest new song, they're done with it at their church, right? Okay, don't die on the hill of your programs. What I was missing, though, was the model. And listen to what the model is. A model is the framework or the structure that you want to be able to duplicate in every ministry in your church. Okay, so you want to give a simple model, a simple system structure to every ministry in your church to follow. And here's the benefit of this. Let me tell you what I mean. I want our children's ministry to reach, teach, mobilize, and to make disciples with a model that is similar or the same as our youth ministry, reach, teaches, and mobilize, and makes disciples. And I want that our adults reach, teach, mobilize, and make disciples. I want the same model working. And here's the benefit of this. If I can get the church to simplify its model, once you get complicated, you're going to have confused people. If I can get the people in our church to simplify and to be doing the same thing, if our children can be taught the same model, the same thing, they're going to become the youth group one day who will do the same thing, which will become your young adults one day, which will do the same thing, which will become your marriage one day that do the same thing. Everything, the whole church is doing the same thing. And this is what was magical in this. Our model, we looked at it, we took it out of James 1, 19 to 24, and this is what we decided we're going to do. What do we want to do? In order to reach, teach, and mobilize, we need to have a model that's working for every ministry. So it's really quite simple. Our model is simply this. You can take this and use this, but I'd encourage you to sit down as pastors with your leaders and go through this and decide, make your own model if you want, right? Build a structure that's going to do this, but simplify, simplify, simplify. Don't run programs just because. Well, every other church does it. Don't do it. Resist the urge. Okay? Stay on the same page. Our model is crazy. It's embarrassing. It's so simple. Okay? Our model is attend church weekly. Number 1. Number 2, join a connect group or a small group. Okay? Attend. We say attend, connect. Our third one is read the Bible daily. Okay? We want attend church weekly, join a connect group, read the Bible daily. Then we say serve, volunteer, and invite. Okay, so it's attend, connect, read, serve, invite. Now, watch. This is how it works. This is the model. And it's quite fascinating when you watch all this get put together. Okay, attend. Can our children's ministry get kids to attend church weekly? Yeah. Connect. Can our children's ministry and our youth ministry, can they do small groups and connect? Yeah. Okay. Read the Bible daily. Can every ministry do this and make this work? Yes. Right? Invite or serve. Can our children serve? Yes. And they should. Right? Every ministry serve. Invite. Can all of our ministries invite? Can our children invite? Our children are some of the biggest inviters ever. Right? Okay, every ministry can do this simple thing. Now, at the end of every service, we tell our people, hey, how do you spiritually grow? Here's what we're saying to you. And we say every single service, attend, connect, read, serve, invite. Now, our programming, that's the model. Our programming then becomes, just simply ask this question. What's the best way to get people to attend the church weekly? What's the best way to get our people involved in a small group? What's the best way to get people to read their Bible daily? What's the best way to get them to serve and volunteer? What's the best way to encourage people to invite? Okay? Now, we did a survey last March, and we discovered in that survey that 78% of our people that attend our church invited at least one person to church in the last, unchurched person to church in the last year. 78% of our people invited at least one. Okay, so does this work? Yeah. Okay, now, and watch. Now, imagine if 80% of your church invited unchurched people to church. Would your church grow? Yeah, massively. Okay, so now let me put this all together for you, and this is where it's all of a sudden the light bulbs will go on. Do you have the sheet here? Yeah, there it is. One here. I want to show you this. This is this is what I taught our church. This is a table and 5 chairs. I'm a visual person. You can all see this, right? Everybody in the back see this? I'm a visual person, so we drew this out on, and we said, okay, how does this work? And I'll even, I might do this on, but I'll have a table and chairs. I might do this for your service on Thursday if it works. Have the table and chairs, and I do this because this really motivates people in your church. It's amazing what I've done it for other pastors, and they come up and they're like, right? It really, really does something amazing for your people. So I put a table and chairs up here, and I describe the chairs. This chair, the bottom one, is not attached to the table. You notice that, right? Okay, it's not attached, it's detached from the... And I define this chair, and you can draw this out if you want. I encourage you to draw it out. And I describe this chair as the unchurched. Okay, they're not sitting at the table yet. The table represents the body of the church, the family of God. They're outside of the church. They're unchurched. Okay, this chair right above it, attached to the table. You want a picture of that? Okay, it's right here on the book too. Look at that. Ow! Look at this. So the chair attached right above it is, I labeled that one born again. Okay. Then this chair right here, I labeled little children. This one young men. This one fathers. And this is the visual. Now watch what happens. I said, this is what I sat down with our team and our staff. If we define a disciple, our goal is to get people to move from this chair to become born again, to move from to this chair, to this chair, to this chair, right? And create movement. Okay, and this is how it works. The visual. What's the best way to get people to become born again? That's the question you have to ask in your church. What's the best way to get people? I've got unchurched people in my community. What's the best way to get them born again? And each pastor, this is up to you. Each pastor is going to answer that question differently. Because your communities are different, your churches are different. But you got to ask the question, what's the best way to? That's the program we got to put in. See, this is why this is the skeleton. You can use the skeleton, but it's going to determine, what you do with this is going to determine how your church grows. Okay? We decided that the best way to, and this is where the model comes in, the best way to get people to be born again in our city is to get them to attend church. If we can get the unchurched people to attend church, we can get them born again. So we said the best way to. So we just said we're going to create services that unchurched people love to attend. That's the program. What's the best way to get people born again? We're going to create service unchurched people love to attend. Hence the creativity. It's serving the mission. Make sense? Okay, that's why you'll see stuff and go, how did they do that? Why did they do that? That's what we want. We're not attracting church people. We want to attract the unchurched people because that's the best way to. Then we said, what's the best way to get the born agains to become little children? And this is what we discovered. And this is all throughout the world, you know this. The highest death rate in human beings still is babies, right? It's dramatically decreasing, thank God. It's cut in half in the last 10 years, I think, which is amazing, thank God. That's awesome, but still the highest death rate. Now, the highest death rate in the church is we can get people born again, but we're not called to make converts, we're called to make disciples. So how do we get them to become little children? Jesus said it this way. This is a scripture that jumped out at me. Jesus said, if you remain in my word, and my word remains in you, you'll be disciples indeed, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now that one verse is loaded with truth. Because it says, if you remain, and we went, oh, okay, if you remain, you can become, whoa, can we, something's happening. Is that me? If you remain, Jesus said, you'll be disciples. And we said the key is to get them to stay. Remain, just stick. If you stick, if you remain, okay, then we said, well, what's the best way to get the born-agains to remain? And we decided that the best way to get the born-agains to remain, to become little children, is to connect in relationships. Okay, so we decided we didn't want to fish with a pole and a rod and a lure anymore. One thing, we wanted to fish with nets. Okay, and the net for our church is the small groups. We decided that relationships were the best way to get somebody who's born again. If they make a friend, they're more likely to come back. Make sense? If they can connect with somebody, and so we did small groups and we did different things to get them to simply connect. And what's the best way to? Again, you have to decide what's the best way to. Now we said we want them to become little children, to become young men. Well, the Bible kind of gave us this one because it says, I write to you young men because you are strong in the word. And so we said, well, young men have to feed themselves the word. So we put in here, the best way to is to get them to read the Bible daily. How do we do that? Find program. I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment, how we're working on this one. Okay, then we said, young men to become fathers. What's the best way to get them to become fathers? Well, we decided that young men are naturally, I don't know if you notice this about teenagers, but teenagers, their world revolves around them. Right? They're kind of naturally just all of a sudden self-aware, and everything revolves around them. And as they mature, they begin to think of others. And we said, well, the best way to get young men to mature enough is to serve. If we can get them serving and volunteering and giving of themselves, they will become fathers. And then fathers, we said, we want our fathers to invite the unchurched to become disciples. All of a sudden you have the circle. Okay? Make sense? Okay, this is the program. Now watch this. I'm going to add a wrinkle, and this changed everything for us. This is how we decided. We looked at this and we said, well, you play this in reverse. Okay? And we said we can tell when somebody's backsliding in our church and catch it and hold them accountable to and all the rest of it when they stop inviting. And the next stage is they stop serving. And the next stage is they stop reading, doing their private disciplines and reading the Bible. And the next thing, they stop connecting with other Christians. And the next thing, they stop attending. And you watch this play in reverse. When I taught this to our church, I had people coming up and going, oh, Pastor Kelly, you're exactly right. I've stopped reading recently because I've gone through all of these stages. And they're like, I know what I got to do. I know what I got to do. And I looked at it and I was like, that's so awesome. It made it so clear to him that he caught himself in his slide and knew exactly what I need to do next in order to grow. Now, our programs are based around simply all of this. We do everything. And we constantly evaluate and say, as a church, where have we stopped? Because systems are all about creating movement. The moment the movement stops, we stop growing, and we've got a problem. And if we get to a place where, okay, we don't have movement from the unchurched to the service, we have to address this problem. If we have a problem where we have lots of the unchurched coming and getting born again, but they're not staying, we've got a systems problem. If we have a problem with a whole bunch of little children and immature ones, but they're not maturing at all, we have a systems problem. And if we have a problem where they're not reproducing and they're all in the church, they're maturing, but they're not making disciples and inviting, we have a systems problem. Make sense? And we evaluate and manage and all the rest of it, and constantly keep track of where these numbers are and are we moving people through. Okay, now, one wrinkle. I put in a 6th chair, okay, just for my church, because I noticed a problem. And I wasn't the first pastor to notice a problem, because I saw Paul had the same problem, so I didn't feel so bad. Okay, I noticed that there was another chair, and I put between the young men and the father's chair, I put a high chair there. Okay, and I actually brought out a high chair on stage for my church. It was awesome. And I said this, the high chair, have you ever taken a toddler to a restaurant? You ever tried? Have you ever had, when you're trying to, maybe you invite another couple out and you want to have a nice, evening out for dinner, and then you bring your toddler along? I mean, isn't it awesome how maybe when you have toddlers that, you used to go out for lunch after church with couples in the church all the time, and then you had a toddler and you're like, yeah, maybe not. Why is that? Because a toddler is distracting. They're noisy, they're messy, they're demanding, they're all the rest of it. And I looked at it, I was going, man, we've got a whole bunch of people in the church that are kind of like toddlers at a restaurant. Huh? Worship was too loud. Worship was too long. Worship wasn't long enough. The pastor's, you're not feeding me the word. We never heard any of that, right? None of us have ever heard that. Okay, all these things and people demanding. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I got a church full of toddlers in a high chair. And I wasn't the first one, because Paul wrote this in 1 Corinthians 3, and I love it in the Message Bible. He says, hey, you should have been mature by now. But instead, you're like babies. And he says in the Message Bible, sucking at your mother's breasts. And so I will feed you milk and take you back to this chair and teach you the basics again. And it says in Hebrews 5, you should have been teachers by now. But instead, you have made it all about you. And he goes on to say it's all about you, and it's selfish, and it's all about you. 1 John 2, at the end of it, he reprimands them for being selfish. And I was like, what? Why? And I put it here, and this is why. I put it here because I noticed that it happens most likely, not at the little children stage to the young men stage. It happens when we stay in the young man chair too long without reproducing. Because when we don't reproduce, when people don't reproduce, they become consumers in the church and not participators in the Great Commission. Right? And then it becomes all about them. And then the church is all about them. And you're not doing this enough, and you're not doing that enough, and you're and looking and going. And I thought, I taught this to my church, and I had a bunch of people coming up to me. Pastor, I want to talk to you about something. I'm not a toddler in the high chair, but and I'm like, hey, if you have to, this is what I said to him. I interrupted him and said, whoa, if you're having to just tell me that you're not there, chances are what you're about to say is probably going to put you there. So if you want to stay out of there, I would just hold that. Can I show you something else? Look at this. If the toddler is here demanding, if you have a bunch of toddlers in your church, who has to pay attention to the toddler? The father does. If the father has to turn, now look at this, he's right here. He has to turn to take care of the toddler. Who does he turn his back on? The born again and the unchurched. And all of a sudden, the pastors begin focusing more on who they're trying to keep than who they're trying to reach, and the church stops growing. So I refuse to cater to the high chair. Okay. Is this helping anybody? Yes. All right. Now watch, this. If you put the system, and this is, draw this out, work this through, think this through, read the scriptures. There's so many scriptures. You know what Paul said to the Corinthian church? You know, Paul said to the Corinthian church, Paul said this, the reason why you're struggling, Corinthian church, the reason why you're not growing is you don't have enough fathers. You have lots of people who can't wait to tell you what you're doing wrong, but you don't have enough fathers who would take the time. And I looked at this and I was like, he's not talking about you don't have enough pastors, you don't have enough staff, you don't have enough, employees. He says you haven't equipped your congregation to be fathers, and the reason why you stop growing is because you've made them all reliant on you. And what happens is, as pastors, is we've designed systems where the church has become reliant on us to do all the visitations, reliant on us to do all the praying, reliant on us to carry the anointing, and we haven't equipped the saints to do the work of the ministry, which is to be the fathers, to reproduce, to invite, to disciple, and all of that. We need to somehow give them tools to equip them, and one of the biggest ways we can equip them is tell them what a disciple is and how to make it. And it's the biggest thing we did, is we just simply said to our church, we defined what a disciple is, and then we equipped them to make them. And we just defined what the warning points are, be careful, and that's all we do. That's all we do. And every program, we don't do other programs, other ministries, all the rest. We don't do any of that stuff. Well, do you have a ladies' ministry? We don't. We have single ladies connect groups because that fits in the circle. That fits the purpose. Because we're driven by the mission first, the vision second, then the model, then the programming. Not driven by the programs. Make sense? Now, we had a problem. And this is what we always are asking, where is the stoppage? And we had a stoppage. We're going, we said we can tell people whether they're participating in the connect groups or not, but we can tell whether people are serving, we can tell if people are inviting, we can tell the number of newcomers coming in, but we're having a really difficult time with the program of how to get people to read the Bible daily. How do we do that? We can do it with children's ministries because they read the Bible and they come in and report and their parents report, and we give them prizes, and we give prizes at the youth ministry. By the way, one of the statistics that I read that kind of really sparked this for me was I read a statistic that said 83% of kids that grow up in the church in North America, 83% of them leave God and leave the church by the time they're 23 years old. 83%. That disturbed me like crazy. And then they said the statistic went down to 0% leave God and leave the church if they grow up reading the Bible 4 times a week or more. I took that statistic to our youth pastor and I said, I don't care what you do, how you do it, get our kids in the Word. Focus, Word. Our children's ministry, we introduced, and I said, we got a Bible reading. Get the kids Bible reading. Get them memorizing the Bible. And we said we have our kids ministry, the big kids ministry, and we have them go into small groups. And the expansion of our kids ministry, because we got them into small groups, was unbelievable. And kids began praying for one another, ministering one another in that setting more so, and begin maturing and growing. And it's like, wow. And we were just, wow. And we started to see amazing results all around the board. But we got asked the question, how do we get people to read? We're not sure. How do we measure it? We're not sure. So I wrote this. It's a 40-day devotional that describes, you see the same symbol on there. It's a devotional written for new believers. It's meant to be, it takes them right from the unchurched chair. How do you get out of the unchurched chair? Well, you got to believe in order to be born again. What do you believe? And I'd take them right through what's the foundation of the Christian faith. It's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'd take them right through everything, what to believe and what it means to follow, and then what it means to be born again, and how do I get to the born again chair, and then how do I become a little children, and what do I need to do? And John says in 1 John that I'm struggling, as little children I struggle with sin, and that's one of the things that it says, it defines in 1 John 2, is they struggle with with sin. I was like, well, how do you do that? How do you overcome that? And what do we do? And so we give them weapons to do that. And then young men, how do we get into the Word and read the Word, and why it's important to read the Word? And we get the little children, by the way, to get them baptized in water as one way to overcome sin. And so we teach them that, and then we teach them to be baptized in the Holy Spirit as well, and what the power of the Holy Spirit does. And then we teach what's the importance of the Word and how to read in the Word. And then we teach them, the fathers, how to invite and how to serve, and why it's important, and each one of these, why it's important to attend church, and why it's important in all these, in 40 days in devotionals, all these devotionals, all the scriptures and all the things, and why it's important to read the Word. And we're giving this to our church, and by doing this as 40-day devotional, because then for 40 days they establish a habit of reading the Bible. Because the biggest reason why they're not reading the Bible is, I don't understand it, I don't know where to start, all the rest of it. And I said, okay, when you're done this devotional, here's where I want you to start in reading the Word. Now, the reason why we put it into print, and 3 years ago we put this system into our church, and it changed our church. And I taught a lot of what 1 John 2 to our congregation. It changed our church. Absolutely unbelievable. The reason why we put it in print is because now this becomes a tool that for every one of our people in our church to become a father, because now I can lead Joseph to the Lord finally. I've been working on this guy for years. I mean, it's been finally lead him to Jesus, and now I can say, hey, read this and let's talk about it. Because now it becomes a tool where he can become a disciple and saying, why should I go to church? Why should I connect? Why should all of these things are in here, and it becomes a tool now to make a disciple. And we're excited about it because we're launching them in 3 weeks to our entire church to give them a tool, become disciplers. We're also making this available now to pastors and church kits, because we decided we're going to do this where, we'll do 6-week course, new believers course, where you can give each new believer a book, do a 6-week small group type thing, so they're not just. They experience what a small group is and how to participate in a small group. They experience how to read the Bible daily because they've got this. It encourages them to attend the church. So you get I think enough for a small group. 30 books, I think, in a small group course. All the sermon notes so that you can preach 1 John 2 in this whole thing. It all becomes there, and it becomes a resource to all the churches so that you can go to work and equip this. Right? So I'm pumped about this, but what I'd want to encourage all of you guys to do as pastors is these are conversations you need to have with your team. Okay? As a leader and with your team, these are conversations you need to have. You need to ask yourself and say, okay, what's our mission? What's our vision? What's the model that we want to employ? And the model must serve the mission and the vision. And what are our programs? What are we doing? And let's work on a structure that we can build and work from there, and then determine, are our programs, and this is the question I asked, are our programs fulfilling our mission? Or are we just doing programs? And I shut everything down at my church. I was like, we were desperate. I shut everything down because I looked at it and said, we're just doing programs, but are our programs actually are they making disciples, or are they just entertaining Christians and keeping people in high chairs, spoon feeding? Honestly, most church programs keep people in high chairs, right? Even our Connect groups work. Our Connect groups, we actually untrain our Bible study leaders. We don't do Bible studies because Bible studies, as soon as you mention them to people, they're like, And the reason why they go, is because they usually attend a small group with somebody who's long-winded and talks the entire time and teaches all their pet doctrines and all the rest of it. And we actually train our small group leaders. If you talk more than 30% of the time in the small group, you're not leading right. And we pull them aside, and we have spies in each one to tell us what's going on, who's saying, seriously. And because if someone's talking too much, if we got a leader, and we've pulled leaders aside and said, Hey, you can't teach. This is not meant to teach. Our connect groups are meant to connect, number one. And number two, you're meant to facilitate Bible discussion. We want you to open up the Bible and ask 3 questions. What does it say? What does it mean? And what do we do about it? Okay? You open up a passage of Scripture and saying, what does it say? What do you think this is saying? And then just ask that question and let people talk. So what do you think that means? Let people talk. It's amazing the revelation you'll get out of people, right? And how much you'll grow just in discussion. And say, what do you think we should do with this information now that we know what it means and what it says? How do you think we should apply that to our lives? What should we do? It's amazing. You don't have to teach anything. The Bible teaches itself. And you're teaching people, and the reason why we do it this way is because we're teaching people how to read the Bible and understand it. Simply by reading any passage and saying, what does it say? What does it mean? What do I need to do about it? And more people are likely to go back into the Word. And more people are likely to attend because they're not listening to one person spout off the entire time. All right, I think I got, does this help?